I would like to express the sincere thanks of all the members of ATO for this wonderful concert made possible by the generosity of the Wurlitzer Company. It is now my pleasure and honor to introduce a gentleman who is not only the most gracious host, but who is primarily responsible for the development of the musical instrument to which this organization was dedicated, the theater organ. It is my pleasure to present Mr. Farny Wurlitzer, Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Wurlitzer Company, who will describe some of his early experiences and association of the bygone years. Mr. Wurlitzer.
Mr. Wurlitzer, to mark this most special occasion, the Niagara Frontier Chapter and ATOE have prepared this plaque to honor you and the theater organ, which we would like to present to you at this time. And I'm going to ask Tiny James to read the inscription.
This reads, "With sincere admiration and respect, the American Association of Theater Organ Enthusiasts take great pleasure in presenting this plaque to our host, Mr. Farny R. Wurlitzer, on the occasion of a luncheon tendered by him at a meeting of the National Convention, North Tonawanda, July 6, 1964. Farny Wurlitzer, in creating that glorious instrument which we all know and love, and which we choose to call the theater organ, has already assured both he and his company a permanent place in the musical history of America. It is impossible to vision the countless hours of enjoyment, the flights into fantasy, the innumerable daydreams, as well as plain, ordinary, everyday enthusiasm that has been engendered in the winds of the millions who have ever listened to his mighty Wurlitzer. It is therefore with great pleasure that we present Mr. Farny Wurlitzer with this small token as a measure of the esteem in which he is held by all members of this organization, signed by myself and Grant Whitcomb, representing the Niagara Frontier Chapter. Mr. Wurlitzer.
You're all far too kind to me. I appreciate this very, very much, and you may be sure that it will have a place in my office where I can see it daily. And I appreciate the kindness that all of you have shown. This is really a red letter day for me, because it brings back many happy memories of the past. I go back to January 1909, when we purchased the business from the DeCleist Musical Instrument Manufacturing Company, and I was chosen to come up here to take charge of the business. I was 26 at that time. I feel, however, you will be interested in having a brief history of what brought us into the theater organ business. The family traces its history back to the first Wurlitzer in 1596, Heinrich Wurlitzer. And in 1659, the first Wurlitzer was born that made a musical instrument. And it is unusual, perhaps, but in every generation that succeeded him, there was either a maker or a dealer in musical instruments. My grandfather dealt in musical instruments in the small village of Schoeneck, Saxony, where my father was born in 1831. And the musical instrument business at that time was a home industry to a large extent. And my grandfather bought the musical instruments from the peasants, who made them largely in the winter season when they weren't busy in their fields. And then he resold them to jobbers and to exporters, and they eventually came to the United States. My father, of course, had experience in this business, and he hoped to become a partner in his father's business. He was the eldest son, but his father decided that that was not the arrangement he had in mind. He wanted to keep the business for the youngest son, who was a child at that time. So my father decided to come to America. He came to the United States in 1853. It is a coincidence that in that same year, my mother crossed the ocean. She was French. My father was German. My father imported the first musical instruments from his father in 1856. And it is from that date on that our business started. When we were musical instrument dealers in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Mr. de Kleist, who had been brought over here by the merry-go-round manufacturers, there were 3 of them in North Tonawanda at that time, from England, to build merry-go-round organs for them, because the duty had been increased and they decided it was necessary to manufacture the instruments here. So Mr. de Kleist, with 1 or 2 helpers, came over from England. He made merry-go-round organs for the merry-go-round manufacturers, but the business got a little slack, and he decided to see whether he couldn't get some additional business by making trumpets for the U.S. Army. So he came down to see my elder brother, who was 12 years older than I am, and we did buy trumpets from him. You see, merry-go-round organs had brass trumpets, so that this was just a short step to making the instruments such as used in the Army. Mr. de Kleist said, "Couldn't you sell some merry-go-round organs?" Brother said, "Well, we might sell 1 or 2 a year, but there's very little demand for them. But if you would make a coin-operated piano for us, we could sell a lot of them." At that time, the merry-go-round organs that de Kleist made had a wooden cylinder. It had usually 10 tunes on it, and by turning a lever on the side, you could choose any one of the 10. So he made a piano the same way, with a long wooden cylinder with 10 tunes on it. And when the model was finished, my brother came up to look at it, and after a number of changes, decided that it was satisfactory, and he ordered 200 of them. Mr. de Kleist didn't have the funds at that time, so he went to the bank and borrowed money on the strength of the order. Well, that business developed, and Mr. de Kleist became prosperous. We had the sole selling rights to all of the instruments. Paper music rolls followed very shortly after that, and the wooden cylinders that were used in the tonophones were discontinued. There were many types of coin-operated musical instruments, and there was an era there where the skating rinks were very popular, and the band organs, as we called them also, were useful, and many of them were sold, and we sold them to skating rinks at that time. The moving picture theaters had not begun. There were Nickelodeons, and for those we had developed an instrument, various models of them, with piano, and the smaller ones with 1 box on one side, the larger ones with 2, and they had 2 music rolls. The one would be rewinding while the other one was playing, and that way the music could accompany the picture in the Nickelodeon. Motion pictures were very short reels, and you paid a nickel or a dime to go in to see the show. So that business was growing, and we felt that there was an opportunity to build instruments for theater. We weren't thinking of motion picture theater because the real motion picture theater didn't exist, and we thought of replacing the orchestras. And we heard of Robert Hope Jones, and he had some financial difficulties, and his company failed in Elmira, New York. He had a distinguished lot of stockholders in it: Mark Twain, Mr. Vail, president of the American Telephone Association, and quite a few others. But Robert Hope Jones whom we investigated quite thoroughly before we entered into business relations with him, had been a continuous failure with everyone that he had been associated with. He first began remodeling an organ in his own church at Birkenhead, England. He electrified it, and that was something very new. He brought the console out of the church and put it on the outside and then played the organ on the inside of the church, which created quite an impression on the church world in England. He lost his own money in building organs. He lost that of his wife, who was a very fine woman. And then he was backed by various people, one of them, I think, to the extent of $250,000. But Hope Jones was an inventor. He had a brilliant mind. He was very persuasive, an unusual looking man. He had a most unusual crop of hair. It was pure white, and I've never seen one like it before nor since. His hair stood up straight, and he really enjoyed walking down Fifth Avenue or Broadway, holding his hat in his hand, and everybody turned to look at him because he was so unusual. But every time he finished an organ, it wasn't good enough. He always had in mind building a better one the next time. And that was why he lost money, because every time he built an organ, it was different. He didn't duplicate anything. He was with several large firms in this country, Skinner and Austin, and then he formed his own company in Elmira, which was a failure. We knew all of these failures, knew that it had been continuous, and perhaps we were conceited enough to think that we knew how to make money with Hope Jones and be a success. Hope Jones came up to see us, and he gave us a demonstration on the organ in St. Paul's Episcopal Cathedral in Buffalo, and tried to interest us in taking over his company, which was in receivership. I recall that demonstration very well. My two brothers were there, I was there, and I was very, very impressed. I had never heard an organ sound like that before. It was beautiful. While he was at Elmira, he built the Ocean Grove organ, which really was an outstanding instrument and is still in use today. We then went down to Ocean Grove and heard that organ, which was marvelous. We entered into a contract with him in April 1910, and we closed the deal with the receiver of the company in May 1910. Our thinking in the early days when we took the business over was the church field, which he had been working with largely, hotels, and theaters.